we are going to turn it over in just a second to Shawn Reagor. Shawn is my coworker, so my love lives here. You can see my button here, is an affiliate of the Montana Human Rights Network. And so I work with Shawn. I've had the pleasure of working with him for 5 years. We started at the same time. And he is the Director of Equality and Economic Justice at MHRN. He leads the Free and Fair Montana, a coalition of progressive organizations working on LGBTQ+ equality, especially during the legislative session. Shawn was a total hero during the legislative session this year. Shawn got his start building trans, non-binary, and two-spirit support groups across the state, and he has a particular love for public education. In his spare time, he enjoys camping with his partner, Cassandra, and his cat, Copernicus. Not kidding, Shawn camps with his cat. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Shawn.
Thanks, Sherilyn, for that great introduction. Hopefully it hasn't raised people's expectations too much for this presentation. I'm going to pull open our slideshow real quick and then we'll get started. So as Sherilyn has mentioned before, I've done this training for a number of years with all different audiences, everyone from some employees from the state of Montana to limited court judges to healthcare professionals. And I change it a little bit each time depending on the audience and depending on different things that I've learned about myself and from the community. But one thing that I think is really important that I always try and do is to start with a nerdy joke. So our nerdy joke tonight will be a neutron walks into a bar and asks the bartender how much for a drink. And the bartender says, "For you, no charge." Now, you may be asking yourself what this nerdy joke has to do with being trans. And the answer is absolutely nothing. I'm a nerdy guy and I really like nerdy jokes. But oftentimes, when people find out that I am transgender, they have so many questions going on in the back of their mind that it's easy just to whittle me and other trans people down to that one piece of our identity. And I think that it's really a mistake because the community is so diverse and different. And even people with experience, even people who are trans, have different experiences about what their trans identity means to them. So what we're going to do tonight is to really talk about some definitions and terminology in terms of what it means to be transgender. We're going to talk about some universal truths about pronouns and how to treat all people, especially trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks, with respect. And then ultimately, I can't give you a play-by-play about how to be an ally in every different situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share some personal stories of mine and share how various people were allies to me in those situations. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So we'll start with a little bit of translating. This is the genderbread person. And I think that it's kind of a fun graphical way to distinguish the difference between gender identity, which is who you know yourself to be, sexual orientation, which is who you're sexually and romantically attracted to, biological sex, which we'll get back to, and gender expression. Gender expression is how you present yourself to the world. It's everything from your haircut and the clothes that you wear to your mannerisms and expressions. Going back to biological sex, oftentimes when we talk about biological sex, that term is confused with sex assigned at birth. Now, sex assigned at birth is anytime a baby is born and the doctor or whoever is present says, "Oh, it's a boy," or "it's a girl." Now, the reality of biological sex is that biological sex is actually much more complicated than sex assigned at birth. Biological sex is made up of hormones and chromosomes and internal and external reproductive organs. Now, oftentimes we're taught that this is simply male or female. However, that's just not the case. All of these systems interact in a complex way to make up someone's biological sex. And in fact, there are people across the world and throughout time who have had what we wouldn't necessarily consider strictly male or strictly female anatomical reproductive organs. This condition is called intersex, and it's actually extremely common. It's so common, in fact, that it is more common than people being born with naturally red hair. So even though this is a common condition, it's something that isn't frequently talked about. And so as a result, there is a lot of stigma around it. Now, just like biological sex, with gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender expression, oftentimes as a society, we're taught to expect that all of these are binary. That is to say that a person either identifies as a man or a woman, they either present themselves in a feminine or masculine way, and they're either attracted to people of the same sex or people of the opposite sex. However, in all of these cases, that's just not the case. And we can see this in a number of ways. Just like when we were talking about biological sex, there's a term called intersex and a condition which encompasses a lot of people that aren't necessarily strictly female or male. Just like that, we see with gender expression, many of you know people that present themselves in a more androgynous or gender conforming way. And with sexual orientation, people aren't just attracted to people that are the same sex or opposite sex of them. Oftentimes, people are attracted to both. Or for some people, they're attracted to neither. This is a term called asexual. And just like with everything else, with gender identity, there are a number of folks out there that don't strictly identify as either a man or a woman. Now, in this slideshow, the term that they refer to is called genderqueer, which is a term that many people still use. However, a more common term these days is the term non-binary. I also would like to talk a little bit about this slide and give a little bit of history behind it. This genderbread person was actually originally created by a trans person to explain the difference between identity, orientation, sex, and expression. However, it was taken by a person who was not trans and made really popular by that one individual. And that one individual actually ended up fundraising and making a lot of money off of this slide. Now, it's not uncommon for folks to take pieces that a historically marginalized community has created for themselves and profited off of them. But it's important to note when that happens and to really reclaim that power for the community that it was stolen from. So let's talk about some terminology. Simply put, someone who is transgender is simply someone that does not identify with their sex assigned at birth. Now, the opposite of transgender is simply cisgender, and that's someone who does identify with their sex assigned at birth. Now, one thing that's really important to note about both of these terms is that they're adjectives. So they're explaining words, which means that it would be inappropriate to say a transgender or transgenders or transgendered. The appropriate terminology is a transgender person, someone who is trans, or I really like the term trans folks. We talked a little bit about non-binary, and just to review that, a non-binary person is someone whose gender identity is not that strictly of a man or a woman. In addition to that, we have the term two-spirit, which is a term used by some Indigenous people to describe a traditional third gender or other gender variant ceremonial and social role to their cultures. Now, it's really important to know that when we talk about the word two-spirit, it means something different to many different tribes. And each individual tribe has a different specific term for it. However, two-spirit is really the umbrella word used to encompass many of those identities. It's also really important to know that if you're not Indigenous, it is not appropriate for you to use two-spirit as an identity word describing yourself. That is something that belongs to Indigenous people and would be improper for anyone who's not Indigenous to claim. So a quick note when we're talking about definitions and identities. It's important to know that you don't have to know or understand a person's identity to treat them with respect. Now, oftentimes many of us have heard more words or definitions related to what it means to be trans that I haven't covered in this presentation. Everything from agender to asexual or and everything in between. Now, it's important to know that you don't have to understand specifically what all of these terms mean to be able to treat someone with respect. And I'm going to spend a bit of time later in the presentation talking about what it means to be able to respect people with a trans, non-binary, two-spirit identity, and how we can really interact with those people in effective ways. It's also critical to trust people to describe who they are and allow them to find labels that they feel best describe their experience. Oftentimes, if you know someone who's starting to transition or who has shared that they identify as transgender, it can be a difficult time to try and wrap your mind around it when you have always associated them as being something else. However, the important thing to know is that no person knows themselves better than the person themselves. It's also important to note that just because two people share the same label does not mean that they have all the same experiences. So, for example, for me as a transgender person, I have an entirely different experience of gender and what it means to be trans than almost every other trans person. Just like many of you as cis folks have different experiences of what it means to be, of what it means to experience your own gender and identity in the world that we live in. So we're going to talk about some universal truths for being respectful. First and foremost, let's talk about names. Now, when I'm talking about names, what I'm referring to is oftentimes when people do decide to transition, they decide to use a name that feels more appropriate and more at home for themselves. It's really important to know that when someone asks you to refer to them by a name, it's really, really important to use that name in reference to them. Whether you're talking to them in the current space, talking about them in the future, or talking about them in the past, even before they transitioned, it's really important to use the name that they ask you to use that you know of at the present time. Now, oftentimes, if you know someone who is transitioning, it takes a little bit of rewiring to learn to use a different name for them. It's really important that you do this for a number of reasons. But if for some reason you do slip up and accidentally use the wrong name in reference to them, simply apologize, correct yourself, and move on. So, for example, I'm sorry, Shawn. Your joke at the beginning was very nerdy. Now, part of the reason that it's so important to simply apologize, correct yourself, and move on is that even though when we recognize we made a mistake, we have a tendency to go back and feel bad and want to apologize and show that it's really important to us that that person knows that we see them for who they are. Oftentimes in conversation, this can cause a number of different issues because it increases a lot of tension in the conversation. It can make the person that you're talking to feel like they need to assure you that you're not at fault or haven't caused harm. And another piece of it too is it can draw more attention to the air. So for example, if you're talking to a number of folks who did not know that person's name, that person's old name before, it can put them in a very difficult spot and potentially put their safety at risk. However, if you simply apologize, correct yourself, and move on, Most of us have often, most of us have previously used the wrong name for another person. For example, I remember when I was in school, oftentimes slipping up and accidentally calling my teacher mom. But in that case, it happens and you just correct yourself and move on like it's any other instance or any other situation. One other note about names is that it's important to not ask someone what their previous name was if you happen to know that they're transgender or if they share that information with you. For me, it's one of the very few questions that I will not answer. And there's a number of reasons for that. But at its heart, I don't feel like sharing what my name used to be increases any more familiarity or awareness of who I am now. And on top of that, oftentimes hearing my old name causes a lot of anxiety and stress for me because it's not a person that I was happy being and not someone that I ever felt like was truly me. Along the same lines with names, we have pronouns. So when I'm talking about pronouns specifically, I'm referring to gender pronouns and gender neutral pronouns. So that's he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, and sometimes something else. Some people, for example, my spouse, do not use pronouns in reference to themselves. So if you hear me talking about my partner, Cass, I always call them Cass unless I accidentally slip up, and will not use a pronoun in reference to them. I actually recommend that you take a pause and at some point, either tonight or tomorrow, practice having a conversation with someone without using any pronouns in reference to anyone else. First of all, it's a really good opportunity to practice not using pronouns. But in addition to that, it will help you realize just how frequently gendered pronouns are used in reference to other people. And this can help you realize if someone is transitioning when they get misgendered, just how frequently that can happen. Now, I mentioned pronouns they, them, and theirs. And for some of us that are a bit older, we may have been taught in school that they, them, and theirs should only be used in reference to multiple people. However, that is incorrect. They, them, and theirs can be used in reference to a single person and should be used in reference to a single person if that person asks you to. The reality is that oftentimes this feels like a foreign concept to us using gender neutral pronouns in reference to someone. However, the reality is that you're probably already doing it in your day-to-day conversations without realizing, and with just practicing a little bit more, it will become more and more natural. So, for example, an example of using they, them, and theirs is they dropped their phone in the middle of the street. I need to get it back to them because the phone is theirs. Now, just like with names, if you accidentally slip up and use the wrong pronouns in reference to someone, the appropriate thing to do is to simply apologize, correct yourself, and move on, just like we talked about with names. One other note about pronouns is that also, as with names, if you're referring to someone that has transitioned to a time before they transitioned, it is still proper to use their current pronouns in reference to them. Now, this is for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it can be very confusing if you refer to someone by different names and different pronouns over the course of a story. In addition to that, not everyone may know that that person is trans or had transitioned. And so you using different pronouns or a name in reference to them can share that information and can potentially put their safety at risk. And finally, as a trans person, I want everyone to know that I am a man. And from my experience, I feel like I always have been a man. And so it is most appropriate to refer to me as the man that I always have. Moving on to questions. I think that it's important to know that the trans community, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community is a wealth of information. As a trans person, you pick up different things in society that most people would never be aware of. I know for me, for example, I was raised as a woman and socialized to behave as a woman. And then I transitioned to be a man. And now that people see me as a man, they expect me to behave in very different ways in the same circumstances. So there's a lot of things that you can learn from those experiences. The other thing that's really important about questions is that it's a way to establish and build upon a relationship and to understand how each individual person needs to be treated with respect. However, the downfall of questions is that oftentimes trans people are used and asked very inappropriate questions. For example, I've been asked if I've had the surgery, what the current status of my reproductive organs are, how I have sex with my partner, and any number of things. And although these questions frequently come from a place of genuine curiosity, the reality is that this is an example of losing the humanity of the person that you're talking to. Oftentimes, the questions that get asked of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members would never be asked to any other individual, because those same questions would be considered inappropriate. So I would like to present you with a little bit of a litmus test for your questions. First and foremost, you should ask yourself, is this a question that you're using to further your relationship with the individual, or is it something that you're asking strictly out of curiosity? Are you asking them because you want to know, or are you asking them because you want to know how that person wants to be treated? So an example of a really great question is, for example, if someone tells you that they are transgender, you can say, "That's great. Thank you for trusting me with this information." If I hear someone who refers to you by your old name, would you like me to correct them? Or another good example of a question is, would you like me to share this with other people, or would you like me to hold this in confidence? Another thing that's important to know about questions is if you can Google it um, and get good information on it, then you should. And the final litmus test is it a question that you would feel comfortable asking your mother? If it's not a question that you would feel comfortable asking your mother, then you should not ask a trans, non-binary, or two-spirit person that question. And really, the important thing to know at the heart of questions is to use questions as a tool to learn how to further respect your trans community members. How can I support you? What do you need? Is there anything that I should be reviewing or looking at in order to support you? Next, let's talk about outing. Now, of course, when I am talking about outing, I'm referring to sharing the fact that someone identifies as transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit without their explicit permission. Now, it's really important to know that there is a lot of violence against trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people in this world. In fact, November 20th on Saturday, we just had a day of remembrance commemorating the people in our community that have been killed and taken from us because of all the violence and misunderstanding of the trans community. So it is absolutely critical that you do not share with anyone the fact that someone is trans, non-binary, or two-spirit without their explicit permission. every time and in every circumstance. And the reason for this, as I said, is that first of all, it's a safety concern. But in addition to that, in the state of Montana as a whole, someone can be fired, not hired, or denied housing because of their trans status. Next, let's talk about coaching. When I say coaching, I am referring to comments like, oh, hey, you look so pretty, but if you do your makeup a little more like this, then no one will know you were ever a man. Or, hey, man, like, if you just like take up a little more space when you're sitting down, people won't even know that you're transgender. Now, oftentimes this comes from a well-meaning place. However, the reality is that comments like these can be incredibly harmful. First and foremost, a piece of that is maybe they're already aware of that and it's something that the person is deeply self-conscious about. And you pointing it out can oftentimes reinforce that insecurity. Maybe it's something that the person hadn't known about, and all of a sudden they're going to start feeling more insecure about it. Another thing that can happen as a result of those comments is that maybe the person likes the way that they do their makeup or likes the fact that they don't take up a lot of space. And bringing this up goes back to reinforcing this idea that people need to behave in a particular way to fit into society. And if they don't, then it's unacceptable. So instead of coaching, I often encourage folks to extend invitations. Now, what I'm talking about invitations is, for example, in one of the support groups that I was facilitating in Bozeman, we had a trans woman show up and she was so excited. And I said, hey, what's going on? And she said, I got invited to a Mary Kay party. I said, that's great. Did you go? And she said, yes. And I said, how was it? And she said, it was boring and terrible, but I got invited to a Mary Kay party. And I think that this is just a simple example of how extending invitations and building relationships with folks and showing that you see them for who they are and how they want to be seen can have an incredibly powerful and positive impact on someone's life. Now, as a side note, if you know someone who is transitioning and there is a typically gendered event that you host, you shouldn't stop inviting someone because they are trans or are transitioning. For example, some people, myself included, really like to crochet. And if for some reason they stopped getting invited to crochet parties because they transitioned, they'd be pretty upset. So really a great way to handle that situation is to use the power of questions and to simply approach the person and say, hey, are you still interested in attending these events? So that wraps it up for our universal truths for being respectful. Does anyone have questions before we move on? Okay, we'll come back for questions at the end.
Shawn,
Next, we're gonna, yes.
before you start, I just wanted to let you know, it seems like the internet connection, it's not horrible, but it's a little wonky. Your pace is great, but I'm just letting you know that there's some crackling coming in, so it's not you, but if you can just keep that nice steady pace that you have been, that'll be perfect because the audio does catch up quickly, but I just wanted to let you know that that's happening. You're doing fabulous though.
Great, thank you. So one other thing when we talk about the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community that it's important to talk about is that the community has really been under political attack. And what we know is all of the bills that have been introduced in Montana and across the country are not as a result of issues that trans people present. Those bills are presented by anti-LGBTQ groups who for years have been working against the trans community. It's really important to know that when we're talking about sports, what we're talking about is whether or not people in our community and young folks are able to participate with their peers and are able to have the same access and all of the same benefits of participating in sports and participating in a team that all of their peers are also able to access. You know, a lot of times they come up with these rumors like the idea that trans women are taking scholarships away from other athletes, when the reality is that to date there has not been any trans athlete that has received a college scholarship to play athletics. So oftentimes they'll present these things as fact when they're just misinformation. And so it's important to see through these and realize that ultimately the goal of all of these attacks is to make it more difficult for trans people to be who they are in their community. So when these types of things are happening, you know, oftentimes I get the question, as an ally, is it really important that I know and be able to talk about politics? Do we have to always talk about politics? And the answer is yes and no. First and foremost, it's really important to be aware of what's going on, to be able to understand and really support people and understand what their experience is. So, for example, as a trans person, I feel an incredible amount of stress about any bill that attacks the rights of my community, whether that's in Montana or out of the state of Montana, whether or not I'm impacted by it. It has a big effect on me and my fellow community members. However, oftentimes when we talk about politics and some sort of bill or policy that is currently being discussed or has recently been passed, it's very difficult because oftentimes all I can think about is that one thing because everyone wants to talk about it, because everyone wants to know my opinion of it, because people want to show me support or they want to share their concern or they're afraid of what's going to happen. However, the reality is that oftentimes this results in people not having any space to be able to share a laugh or cat videos or different things like that. So it's really important to be aware of what's going on and to show people support. However, it's also really important to provide space and relationships away from just that sole focus of their trans identity. One thing, for example, that I really value during the legislative session is being able to sneak away and play music with the handbell choir that I'm a part of, for example. So, with that in mind, I'm going to kind of move on and share some of my own stories and talk about how people were allies to me in each of those situations, and some takeaways and some learning examples. So first and foremost, let's talk about Mark. Mark was a professor of mine at Carroll when I was studying to be a chemistry major. I had a number of math classes with him. And before I left to go to college, this was before I had transitioned at all, I recognized that I was attracted to women. And I hadn't told anyone. And I was really nervous about how it would be received. In addition to that, I had never been in a relationship, and I wasn't sure that I would ever pursue a relationship with anyone. So the summer before I went to college, I had a seasonal job that I loved. It was outdoors, it was active. I was living on location, so it gave me a little bit of an opportunity to gain some independence and get some space from my family. And at the end of the season, I was approached by the director and told that I was really valued as an employee and they wanted me to come back and work the next season, and that they would be giving me $100 a week raise. This sounded great to me, and I was really excited about it. And so the director said that he would contact me sometime midwinter to confirm that I was still interested, and we would begin the process from there. As it turned out, I didn't hear anything from him, and all of a sudden I started hearing other people talking about this position because it had been posted for applications to be received. And I thought that that was really strange, but maybe he had just forgotten or maybe I misunderstood. So I gave him a call up and said, "Hi, this is Shawn Reagor. I'm contacting you. I'm really interested in this position. Is it still available?" And he said, "Oh, well, I guess I can send you an application." Once again, this struck me as odd, but I didn't think anything of it. And I received the application and filled it out and sent it in. And I didn't hear anything and didn't hear anything. And eventually I contacted him and left a message for him just to even confirm that he had received the application. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail that was 4 lines long. It said, "Thank you for your application. Unfortunately, we're unable to offer you this position at this time. Good luck with your studies and thanks for your service in previous years." I was really confused about this because I didn't know what was going on. And so I called up my former supervisor and asked him if he could tell me anything about it. And the former supervisor said that he could not. And so I asked, "Well, can you tell me if it's because I'm gay?" And he said, "Officially, I can't say anything." And I said, "Unofficially." And he said, "Yes. And it is also the reason that I have decided to terminate my employment with this employer because he refused to hire me." So for me, I had a difficult time processing all of that because it was my first experience with discrimination. As a white female presenting person at the time, I had very little clear experience with discrimination. And I didn't know how to process it and I didn't know what to do. So I walked to one of my professor's offices. I asked if he had time, and I just sat down and I still had the letter in hand and I just spilled my guts. And I came out to him and I told him about how disappointed I was and how frustrated I was, especially because this was a job that I really cared about. And he did a number of things that were really great. First and foremost, he provided immediate support. He sat there and he listened to me for probably half an hour to 45 minutes. He didn't try to fix or minimize the problem. He didn't say, "Oh, this isn't a big deal. Don't worry about it. You'll have hundreds of jobs in your lifetime. This is just one. They don't deserve you, and you probably don't want to work for them anyway if they treat you this way." Because for me, it was a very big deal and it was very painful. And then after that, what he told me simply was, "I think there may be a position here on campus over the summer that might be available. If you're comfortable, I'd like to ask around and see if that's available." He didn't say, "Don't worry about it. I have a job that you can take and you'll definitely get it and everything will be better." And then finally, he quietly asked around and did find a position. Now, the thing that's important to note about this, when he did it, he didn't go around campus and say, "Oh, I have a gay student who lost their job. Oh, by the way, did you know so and so is gay? They really need a job." Instead, he started with the departments that he knew were the most LGBTQ friendly. And he said, "I have a student who's in need of a job. These are what their qualifications are. I think that they would be great and they could really use the support." And then as a result of that, I got hired on actually um, at the college doing work and I was able to stay on campus all 3 of my summers. and was able to build really great and meaningful relationships at the college itself. So let's talk a little bit about the transgender experience on the job. Every handful of years, there is the National Center for Trans Equality puts out a survey to understand the impacts of discrimination and rates of discrimination on the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community. What they found is that of respondents, 90% reported experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job, or said that they hid their identity specifically to avoid these things. In the trans community, there is double the rate of unemployment. Now, to put that in perspective, 47% of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks report being fired, not hired, or denied a promotion specifically because of their identity. And we also know that folks are 4 times more likely to make under $10,000 per year than the general population. Now, in contrast to this, what we actually know is that the average trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community member has a higher level of education than the rest of the general population by about 2.5 years. So there's no reason that these numbers should be looking like this. In addition to that, of the people that transitioned on the job, 78% said that they felt more comfortable at work and said that their job performance actually improved because they had transitions. So just to put some of these numbers in perspective. So next, let's talk about Zach and KAMMI. I grew up in a very conservative, very traditionally religious family. And I knew that my family was not going to accept my transition very well. I decided that ultimately I couldn't wait for them and I couldn't wait for their acceptance because I could not continue going on and living my life as I had been living because I was so unhappy. And I knew that something needed to change. And the thing that I could change was me. So I decided to transition, and it was a bit of time before I told my parents that I was going to transition and that I did identify as transgender. And so, in preparing for that conversation, I figured out all of the details. At the time, I was a student at Carroll and I was playing the drums in the pep band. And my dad had come to basketball and football games in the past to watch me play the drums. So my plan was to talk to my father and my father alone and not talk to my mother, who tended to be a bit more prone to hysterics. I would meet up with my dad ahead of time. I would wear, more gender neutral clothes, more androgynous clothing, so that they wouldn't immediately be put on their guard. And then in addition to that, when I told my dad, I wrote out exactly what I was going to say. And then I was going to tell him before the pep band game so he could, if he wanted to, still come to the game, sit in the stands, watch me play the drums, realize that I was still his kid. And then we could meet afterwards if he wanted to talk more after he'd had a little bit of time to process. And then in addition to that, he would have the 90-minute drive home to figure out what on earth he was going to tell my mother. And by the time she found out, I would be a long way away. Unfortunately, whatever they say about best laid plans is ultimately true. And my parents showed up together. Now, I wasn't expecting this, but I quickly changed plans and decided that I would wait until my mom went to the craft store. And then my dad and I would have at least a few hours alone to chat. And we would talk and I would share that information with him then. So my parents came to pick me up and we rode together. We went to a restaurant in Helena. And about halfway through the meal, my mom turned to me and she said, So what's your diploma gonna say? And I thought, oh shoot, here we go. And I tried to play dumb, and she was not having it. And I said, well, I don't know. I've never seen a Carroll diploma before. I assume it's going to say Carroll College. And she was like, well, then what? And I said, I don't know. I haven't seen a diploma before. And she said, well, fill in the blanks for me. Carroll College presents this degree in chemistry too. And she stopped and looked at me. And I said, to Shawn Reagor. And she said, what? And then I shared that I was going by Shawn and that I was intending to change my name legally, and that I identified as trans. And she got very, very upset. In the middle of the restaurant, she ripped my hat off my head and threw it on the floor and started to create quite a scene. It was all my dad and I could do to quiet her down, and try and exit the restaurant without making even more of a scene. To be perfectly honest, I'm not even sure that we paid our bill. But anyways, we got out of the restaurant and went to the car, and my parents owned a two-door Honda Accord at the time. So there was a back seat, but there were no back seat doors. So my dad got in the driver's seat. My mom opened up the passenger door and flipped the lever to open, pull forward the passenger seat so I could crawl into the back seat. And I looked at the car and thought, oh, heck no. That is a trap, and there is no way to get out of that vehicle. I am not getting in that car. And as it turned out, even though I was saying no in my mind, I watched myself as an out of body experience get in the car and sit down in the car. And there I was trapped. And unfortunately for me, my parents refused to let me out of the vehicle. They drove around Helena for several hours. Now, fortunately for me, I did have my cell phone. And so during that time, they were sharing all of the reasons that I should not be transgender and how it was made up to be trans and it wasn't a real thing. And during that time, I had my phone and I started texting a couple of my friends. One of them was Zach and one of them was KAMMI. I started talking to KAMMI first, and I told her what had happened and the fact that I was stuck in the vehicle. And KAMMI said, okay, well, what can I do to help? And I said, I don't know. Maybe if you drive up, they'll let me out of the car. So she drove up to where we were parked. Um, and as she drove up, my dad drove off. And so actually what she ended up doing was she followed us around Helena, the entire time. And although I do not recommend texting and driving, we were in contact the entire time. And anytime she stopped hearing from me, she would send a text to check in on me and see if I was still okay. KAMMI also offered to call the cops and report me as kidnapped, which was actually a fairly smart way to handle that situation. I'm really glad that she asked first because I wasn't prepared to do that and I didn't want to escalate things. And that gave me the power to know in that situation, yes, I was in the vehicle and my parents were saying terrible things. However, the reality was I was more in control knowing that KAMMI was there and had eyes on the situation and was ready to take action, and was prepared to find a way to get me out of that situation. So it made me feel much, much safer in that entire experience. So there's a number of things that KAMMI did really well in that situation. First of all, She provided emotional support. She continued the conversation in a crisis, and she kept eyes on and was ready to take action. Now, after a little while of driving around, I think it was probably 3 or 4 hours, my dad started to realize that irreparable damage was happening to our relationship. And so I think he started to realize that it was time to end the conversation. And I think in an attempt to try and get my mom to stop, he drove up and pulled up into one of the parking lots at the college. Unfortunately, she did not exactly get the hint, or if she did, she decided to ignore it, um, and continued on. And so at that point, I started to talk to my other friend, Zach, um, who was at the college at the time. And he said, okay, well, if it's okay with you, I'm going to come downstairs and try and get you out of the car. I said, well, how are you going to do that? And he said, I have no idea. Let's find out. And so he did. He walked up to the car and he knocked on the window, which my mother rolled down about 2 inches. And she said, what do you want? And he said, Mrs. Reagor, I just really need your kid out of the car because I can't find my car. And I think that they'll be able to help me find it. Now, the dude where's my car does not exactly play very well with mothers, and she saw right through him. She said no and rolled up the window. However, he did something really smart after that. He said, okay, I'll be back in 5 minutes. He walked away and came back 5 minutes later and knocked on the window again and said, Mrs. Reagor, I really need your child out of the vehicle. And once again, she said no. And he said, okay, I'll come back in 5 minutes. And I think it was at that point that she finally decided to let me out of the vehicle. Now, there's several things that Zach did in this situation that were really good. First and foremost, he took a different tactic. He took more of a direct intervention tactic. He asked before stepping in, which was really important in this situation when my safety was at risk. And then in addition to that, he tried to diffuse the situation instead of inflaming it. He could have gone up to the vehicle and said, Mrs. Reagor, you're just being a jerk. And you need to recognize that Shawn is a person and should be treated with respect, and you should let him be who he is. However, because my safety was at risk and I was in a position where they had control over my actions, it was really smart of him to simply ask for me to be out of that situation for a completely different reason. And then after this entire incident happened, there's several things that my friends did that were really important collectively. First of all, we all went out to a restaurant together that did not serve any alcohol. This was really intentional. The first reaction could have been, it's been a shitty day, you're over 21, let's go and get a drink. However, instead of doing that, they said, let's go and get food together. Let's share this space together and let's support you. They provided food and company. And then they brought in reinforcements. Many of my other friends knew that I was coming out to my family, and they had all been in communication ahead of time. And so they were prepared immediately to bring in other friends and make sure that I was surrounded by people and to make sure that I knew that I was loved and respected and seen as who I am by many. I will say one thing that was always helpful that my friends did after I spent any sort of time with my family was to make sure that they used my name and pronouns as often and as accurately as possible. It was really, really grounding to be able to hear my name and to hear masculine pronouns in reference to me and to know that, yes, this is who I am and I can be seen and can be respected for that. So what we know about the trans experience is that family rejection is extremely common. In fact, 57% of the trans, non binary, and two spirit population reports experiencing family rejection. Now, of the people that experience family rejection, they're 3 times as likely to be homeless, 72% more likely to be incarcerated, and 59% more likely to attempt suicide. So, what do we do in the face of all of this? The really important thing to know is that the best way to respond in the face of all of this rejection and all of this political pressure and everything else that the trans community faces is to be able to show support and build relationships with trans, non binary, and two spirit community members. Having relationships with people and being an active and engaged part of the community drastically decreases the likelihood of all of these negative impacts. And it can help people feel more engaged and be more active and whole within their community. It also shows the community as a whole that just because someone's trans doesn't mean they're any less a part of our community, doesn't mean that they're any less engaged, doesn't mean that they're any less likely to love telling nerdy jokes or enjoy playing in a handbell choir. The reality is that all of these things help build up the community and build resilience when some of the negative things come down the line. The last story that I'm going to tell is what I like to call the toothbrush story. And this involves my friend KAMMI that I mentioned before and another friend of mine named Hannah. The story is the story of the first time that I ever told anyone that I was trans and that I was going to transition. And let me tell you, I was nervous. And it wasn't because I didn't think that my friends weren't going to respect my identity or accept me for who I was, but more so, it was because saying it for the first time made it real. And because of all of the negative stigma around being transgender, making it real made it scary. But anyways, so I decided that I was going to tell my friends. I had been trying for several weeks to tell them. It was at the very end of my junior year of college. And I had, at the time, I did not have a vehicle. And so oftentimes when my friends went to the grocery stores, they would take me with them. And one time this had happened and some of my stuff got mixed in with theirs. So I went and I knocked on their door and I decided that I was going to get my stuff back. And most importantly, I was going to tell them that I was transitioning. So I went and I knocked on the door. And one of my friends opened the door and gave me, as it turned out, the only thing that had been mixed in with their groceries was a toothbrush. So she gave me the toothbrush and she said, "Oh, here you go. This was mixed in with our groceries." And I said, "Oh, okay." And she went back and sat down and started studying again. And I stood in the middle of their kitchen, in the middle of the entryway, for probably about 5 minutes. And after about 5 minutes, one of my friends kind of turns to me and goes, "What's going on? Are you okay?" Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm fine. And I stood there for probably a total of 20 minutes after that, trying to work up the nerve to tell my friends that I was trans. And after about 20 minutes, my friends, not knowing what was going on and it being finals week, said, it's finals week. We have to go study and you're acting kind of strange. So let us know if you need anything and we'll see you later. And they got up and they left. And I stood in the middle of their kitchen and I was thinking, man, I was going to tell him, I was going to tell him. And then I thought, you know what? It's not too late. So I took off after them and chased them down in the middle of one of the parking lots, toothbrush still in hand. And I said, I have something I need to tell you. And my friend KAMMI said, what? And I said, I think I'm transgender. And I spit it out so fast, I'm surprised that they understood a word of what I said. But fortunately, they did. And my friend KAMMI said, okay. Um, and the tone that she took was like, okay, like, so what? Like, and then I had worked myself up so much to that point, and I was so nervous that after I said that, I realized I didn't know what I was going to say afterwards. So I said, that's it. And I turned and ran. And as I was running away, my friend Hannah called out afterwards and said, "We still love you." And then apparently the conversation when they got in the car was as follows. "Well, that's a big shocker," sarcastically. His mom's going to kill him. And what was the deal with the toothbrush? So a couple months after that, I had started to socially transition. I was going by Shawn regularly. People used my name and pronouns in reference to me. And I was starting to feel more whole and more like myself than I had ever before. And my birthday was coming up. And those two friends got me a card for my birthday. And it was a Dr. Seuss rhyming card that was happy birthday to a boy who is one. And on the front, a toothbrush was attached to it. And it said, because every big event needs to be celebrated with a toothbrush. So that's the toothbrush story. That's the story of how I came out for the first time. And I think that it's a really great example of how just being in relationship with people and sharing support can be really, really impactful and really meaningful. So at this time, I am going to turn it over for some questions. We have plenty of time for them, so do not be shy. If you're not sure if it's an appropriate question or not, I will let you know. Go ahead and ask it, and we'll talk through whether or not it's a good question to ask me or any other person. I think the best way to be able to ask your question is in the Q&A function at the bottom or in the chat.
Yeah, so go ahead and type in, I'm going to ask you to type in any questions into the Q&A. And when they pop up, I will read them to Shawn and then he will answer them for you. So don't worry about it. Don't be shy. Please feel free to ask any questions. To my friends at GQA here, if you guys have any questions, you can just like walk in and hand me a note or something like that. So go ahead and if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat.
While we're waiting, one of the questions that I get most frequently, and I forgot to address earlier on, is what do you do if you can't tell someone's gender identity or you don't know what pronouns to use in reference to them? And this is a really great question. And there's really three different things that you can do. First and foremost, what I like to do and what I always recommend is simply to ask. You know, as someone who is trans and has been misgendered previously and was in a space where people couldn't tell what my identity was or thought that they knew and were guessing, and half the time were guessing wrong. I would really, really rather be asked than have someone guess and be wrong. As a trans community member, I actually really appreciate when people ask what my pronouns are because that allows me the opportunity to define them for myself rather than having people guess. A really great way to ask that question is to simply do it when you're introducing yourself. So, for example, hi, my name's Shawn. I use he, him pronouns. What's your name? What pronouns do you use? It's becoming more and more common in meetings for people to introduce themselves with pronouns and to include pronouns in their email signature. And these are both really, really great things to do. Not only does it share information about you and build a relationship with other people, but also it demonstrates that it's okay for other people to do that and creates a standard where it's more socially acceptable. Another way to handle that question is to not use any gender pronouns in reference to the person. So use they, them pronouns in reference to people. Now, as long as this is not done as a way to avoid using a proper pronouns for a trans person, it is a great thing to do. What I mean by that is I have a friend who works at a library, and when one of his colleagues found out that he was transgender, they actually started using they them pronouns in reference to him as a way to avoid using male pronouns in reference to him, and doing it intentionally. That's not a good thing to do. However, in general conversation, unless someone tells you otherwise, it is appropriate and acceptable for you to use gender neutral pronouns in reference to people. The final thing to do is to not use any pronouns in reference to that person and to simply use their name. As one thing that I mentioned earlier, this is something that you can practice and will give you a lot of great perspective in a number of different ways.
Thank you, Shawn.
So it looks like we have a question.
Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
I can read it, I think.
Okay.
Excellent. The question we have here is, first of all, Sharon, thanks for nerd jokes. I love nerdy jokes. I can go on all night, but I will refrain. The question is, are there any non-binary terms for aunt and uncle and nephew and niece? So funny enough, one of the big things that really drove me to transition was I hated being referred to as an aunt. I loved my nephews and now niece to add to it. However, it was really difficult for me to hear aunt in reference to myself, even when my adorable nephews were referring to me by that name. So, one, I've heard a number of different terms in terms of a gender neutral term for nieces and nephews. I've heard the term nibbling. I really like nibbling. That's actually the term that my partner and I use for both our nieces and nephews, and nibblings. And then there are a number of different terms for aunt and uncle. And oftentimes, the best way to navigate that is to simply ask the person what they would like to be referred to as. I have someone who really likes to be referred to as nuncle. I know someone else who likes to be referred to as anicle. And there's a number of different terms, but really it's up to the person to best define that for themselves. If you have heard other terms in reference to either nieces or nephews or aunts and uncles, please go ahead and share them in the chat with each other. This is a great place to share resources. Speaking of resources, we have some great resources for folks to be able to take a look at. I'm going to share my screen once again so you all can see these. So the studies that I have referred to all come from the National Center for Trans Equality. In addition to that, there is a local organization called the Rural Transgender Wellness Project that did a study in the state of Montana to affect what things affect people's mental health, overall wellness, and suicidality in the state of Montana. That has been a peer-reviewed and published study, and you can find it in the Journal of Rural Medicine. In addition to that, there are a number of different organizations. One specific organization is called WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Other great resources out there include the Montana Gender Alliance, which is a state based network of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit support groups. We have both in-person and online meetings, and we also have a specific meeting place for parents of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks. Another fantastic resource is the Transgender Law Center, and the final resource I'll share with folks is the National Center for Trans Equality. Locally in the state of Montana, we have the Montana Human Rights Network, which hopefully you've heard a little bit about from Cheryl Lynn. We have the Montana Gender Alliance, which I mentioned, and then we also have an organization called Transvisible Montana. You can follow Transvisible Montana on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Shawn, I had an in-person question here. Can you explain the term TERF?
Yes. So TERF is an acronym. It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. So TERF. And it is a self-coined term. So people who hold this belief originally created the term to describe themselves. And what it is people who say that they identify as feminists, but argue that trans people do not exist and people's gender identity is solely based on their sex assigned at birth. You may have heard the term a little bit in reference to a rather famous fiction author who has been known to go on Facebook and Instagram and social media and share negative information and false information about the trans community.
Thank you. So we have another question here is, what's a good way of explaining the value of using pronouns to someone who is resistant to pronouns? Especially as a cisgender person, some people I have interacted with are annoyed when I introduce my name and say she, her, when I'm obviously to them a woman.
Yes, so the reason that it's important to include pronouns in your introductions, or for example, even in your Zoom names, as you can see it demonstrated by all of us here tonight, is that first of all, it shares information about you. Because oftentimes there are people make assumptions about what someone's pronouns are, and oftentimes they're wrong. I remember when I was in high school, I worked at a fast food place and I was told never to use gendered pronouns or call someone sir or miss or ma'am over the intercom because you're just hearing their voice and you never know until you're able to see that person in person. Well, now that we know more about the trans community and more people are coming out as trans, non-binary, and two-spirit and holding those identities, it's harder and harder for people to assume and actually get right those pronouns. So a piece of it is that it's important to share because you never know what someone's pronouns are. The second piece of it is that it is really important to normalize that for trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members, because then it makes it safer for everyone to be able to share their pronouns, especially people who are commonly getting misgendered. As a trans person, part of the reason that I think it's so important to be able to use the correct pronouns is because oftentimes that's how we show respect for people. One thing that's different about pronouns than titles is that pronouns are he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs. Titles reflect a specific position such as reverend, pastor, senator, representative, etc. However, you use them for the same reasons. It's important to use accurate titles in order to show respect to those individuals, just as it's important to use the correct pronouns to show respect and be able to interact respectfully with other individuals. Intentionally using someone's pronouns wrongly is violence. It causes severe harm and distress, both to the community member internally and to others, because it demonstrates to others and encourages other people to use the wrong name and pronouns in reference to them. And it can also create a safety issue for that person if they're not out.
Thank you. You all have been hanging in there and during this whole presentation, which is wonderful. It's so great to have so many of you with us. Last call here for questions. Great, go ahead. I see in the chat, I have one more question. Go for it. And while we're waiting for that question to pop up, I just want to thank Shawn for doing this presentation. I think one thing that's really difficult is about this kind of education. I know Shawn loves doing it, but at the same time, having to ask people who have faced discrimination to relive their pain and sometimes trauma is really difficult. And so I want us all to just kind of honor Shawn for what he's been able to share with us tonight. That's been difficult chapters in his history, and he has so eloquently described all of this, so a lot of us can learn. And so I'm waiting for the other question here for just a minute. Okay, I am a grad student in the counseling program, and I was wondering what is something I can do to help my future clients from the LGBTQ plus community?
Yes, so there's a number of different things that you can do. If you want to specify what you mean by client and what specific area you're going into, unless I missed that, that can help me give more specifics. But in general, something that all different business owners or people that interact with the public can do is to look at things like your intake forms and have someone who is a trans community member or have us as an organization review those forms. That's one thing that we are more than happy to do. Um, there are small things that, for example, asking things like pronouns or how or if you need to ask about what someone's gender identity is and how to do that can be really, really important. And there are some strategic ways that doing that can help show people that you intend and try to be respectful of their gender identity. Another thing that you can do um,
So
is to
go ahead.
continue to seek education like this. As I mentioned, this is one of the presentations that we do as an organization. However, we have a number of other presentations. We have what I like to call a Trans 202 that focuses specifically on storytelling and supporting the trans movement without doing unintentional things that will cause harm. And it looks historically back on a number of different things, like how trans people have not been able to tell their stories in their own meaningful ways in the past. And then another training that we present, we do trainings for nonprofits, for organizations, and for businesses to talk about how to interact with folks in a very meaningful way, and we're happy to do that. And then the final thing that you can do is you can pay attention to what's going on politically and in the world today. Some of the best advocates that we have are mental health care providers and physical health care providers that showed up multiple times during the legislative session and worked with us to craft really meaningful testimony to be able to share their own experiences about working with trans folks and really work with legislators to try and prevent harmful legislation from passing.
Okay, truly and completely, this is last call for questions. One final question here. Anyone? Anyone?
If no one else has a question, then I will share one last quick story. And this story it's funny because speaking of people being told how to tell stories, one thing that happened to me when I was first getting in this work is that we were up against a bathroom bill that would require people to use the bathrooms according to their sex assigned at birth. And there were a group of people that told people not ever to tell anyone about what it's like to use the bathroom as a trans person because the general population as a whole has discomfort around bathrooms. And the last thing we want people to think about is what it's like and the fact that trans people are actually already using bathrooms. And so one time I was asked a specific question about that, and I told this story. And afterwards, I had so many people that came up to me and said that that was one of the more important stories that they heard because it gave them a different perspective. So that's a little bit of history on why I tell this story. And then the story itself is about the first time I used the men's restroom. And I was a student at Carroll once again, and it was getting to the point where it was very awkward for me to use the women's bathroom. First of all, I didn't want to be in there because I didn't identify as a woman. And then, in addition to that, I didn't want other people to see me using that bathroom because I didn't want them to think that I was a woman. And I just had baseline discomfort. And the further along I went in my transition, the more funny looks I got when I was using the women's bathroom. So it had gotten to the point where I avoided the women's bathroom and used gender neutral, also known as unisex bathrooms. And this became quite a chore. Although it was what I was most comfortable with at the time, I had to go way, way out of my way between classes. I was running and like dripping with sweat, and I'm just naturally a very sweaty person, so it was uncomfortable for everyone around me. In addition to that, but I got to the point where I realized I couldn't keep just trying to avoid using the bathroom. Plus, for me, it was another piece that was affirming to who I was. The idea of being able to use the men's bathroom was very scary. However, it was a piece of it was also affirming and saying, yes, this is who I am. I am a man. I use the men's bathroom just like all of my other peers. So I planned it out very carefully. And actually, I spent a lot of time on the internet um, reading and watching YouTube videos about proper men's bathroom etiquette. And there were a number of things that I learned. There is very strict men's bathroom etiquette. Oftentimes, men are taught this in a very informal way and pick it up on their own. But since I hadn't been taught that, and since I was an adult, I would be expected to understand and know what that was without having any of those learning opportunities. So, one thing that I learned was you don't talk to anyone, you don't look at anything, you avoid eye contact at all costs, and you spread yourselves out as much as possible. So, I felt prepared. I was like, okay, I'm going to use the men's bathroom. I found the men's bathroom that was furthest out of everyone's way. It was actually next to the chemistry labs. And I picked a time when there were no labs in session, so no one would be around. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to use the bathroom. And I went in and I started to use the bathroom and I came out and I started to wash my hands. And as I was washing my hands, one of my chemistry professors walked in. And it was like alarms and sirens started going off in my head. And I was so nervous and so scared. And he started talking to me. And I was thinking, this isn't proper men's room etiquette. I don't know how to handle this situation. So I just said, and just like took off and ran away. And then I had to go to a different bathroom downstairs to actually be able to dry my hands. But I think that it's a really good opportunity to demonstrate that trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks spend a lot of time being intentional about who we are, where we're at, and how we present ourselves. And trusting that, and trusting that we know what's best for us and for our own comfort and the comfort for everyone else around us is really important. And that's one of the best things that you can do to support the community. So if you have any more questions that come up that you weren't able to ask, I'm more than happy to share my contact information. You can reach out and email me anytime. And I am more than happy to serve as a contact to help provide resources or to answer any questions that you have.
So I want to thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you for being eager to learn more about the trans experience and how you can understand trans people's lives more. We want to give a huge shout out to Shawn for all of the work that he put into this presentation and all of the amazing stories that he's and education he's given us tonight. Thank you to Glacier Queer Alliance for hosting us, or at least me here in Kalispell tonight, and for hosting a watch party. And I hope you all have a lovely week and a wonderful holiday season. Please reach out to Shawn. He gave his contact information in the chat. So if you have any other questions, please reach out to us. But we wish you a very good week.